Every dollar of waste in our defense budget is a dollar we can't spend to support our troops or prepare for future threats or protect the American people. Our budget is a zero-sum game.
Something happened today in Washington that defies the common wisdom of 50 years of American politics. In raw mathematical terms, what happened today was $2 billion got dropped out of a plan to spend $700 billion. That means it was almost literally a drop in the bucket. But this particular drop was such a totally unexpected, nuh-uh, no way, it can never be dropped, drop in the bucket, that D.C. common wisdom might never recover. What happened is that the Senate voted to not pay for more of a specific kind of plane that's called the F-22. The F-22 was a great idea when what we thought war would be having Top Gun pilots, having aerial dogfights with similarly armed Top Gun pilots who were from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never had time to come up with anything like the F-22, though, before they went kaput. And since then, the F-22 has essentially been the vestigial third nipple of the defense budget. It's pointless, but it's still there. Here's why.
I arrived in Washington 43 years ago this summer. Of all people, I am well aware of the realities of Washington and know that things do not change overnight. After all, the influence of politics and parochial interests in defense matters is as old as the Republic itself. Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War, was charged with building the first American fleet. And to get the support of Congress, Knox eventually ended up with 6 frigates being built in 6 different shipyards in 6 different states.
Why would he do that? See? Because then you'd get the members of Congress from those 6 different states all to be political allies for building those frigates. Well, that was revolutionary days. Same goes for the F-22. When Lockheed Martin set out to make them 30 years ago, they planned from the beginning to have parts for these planes made in 40 different states. So members of Congress from those 40 different states would have reason to support building more of the planes, just for the sake of local interest, just for the sake of jobs, regardless of the usefulness of the planes. And bingo, we ended up in a situation where the Soviet Union hasn't existed for 20 years. Every F-22 cost $350 million to build. They're not useful for our current conflicts. No F-22 has flown a single mission in Iraq or Afghanistan. The military does not even want F-22s. They've been known to trap their pilots inside them. They take more than 30 hours of maintenance for every hour they're in the air, but for some reason, we keep building more of them. And even the biggest, hawkiest hawks in the defense world know that this is dumb.
With regard to something like the F-22, regardless of whether the number of aircraft at issue is 12 or 200, if we can't bring ourselves to make this tough but straightforward decision, reflecting the judgment of 2 very different presidents, 2 secretaries of defense, 2 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the current Air Force Secretary and Chief of Staff, where do we draw the line? And if not now, when? If we can't get this right, what on earth can we get right?
I would only add to President Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation, which is compelling in many ways, that it should be changed, the word should be changed from military-industrial to military-industrial congressional complex.
Senator John McCain joining those who spoke out against funding the F-22 before it was voted down today in the U.S. Senate. The military-industrial congressional complex, of course, is John McCain's reference to Eisenhower's 50-year-old warning that us creating a huge domestic industry that needs war and preparation for war to be profitable also creates huge permanent incentives for war over peace and for the defense budget above everything else we spend money on.
We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
It took 50 years, but maybe this decision today in Washington means we're finally, 50 years later, listening to Ike. Joining us now is Congressman Barney Frank, chair of the House Financial Services Committee. He has opposed funding for the F-22. Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for coming back on the show tonight.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Rachel. It's a very important issue.
Do you think it's true that this plane is still being made today after all these years because of domestic politics and not because of its usefulness?
Oh, without question. Actually, you know, we've been having this debate about whether or not we need a second stimulus, and people have missed the point. My conservative colleagues have a second stimulus. It's the F-22. They don't even pretend that it has a military mission. It's extraordinary. These are the people who said, don't do an economic recovery bill. Government can't create jobs. Any government spending, in fact, detracts from jobs, except for weapons. It's kind of armed Keynesianism. They find somehow in spending money on the military a power to create jobs that doesn't exist elsewhere. And you're quite right that they try to spread this out. That's why today's victory was a very important one, but it's not the last one. The committees, the armed services and committees in the House and the Senate, and the military appropriations subcommittees are still for this plane. They're composed of my colleagues who really feel these things are very important. So next week we're going to have another vote because the appropriations bill on defense will come to the floor, and I'm delighted to be able to tell people, please write your representative. The Senate's done its job, but there's going to be an effort to have this plane rise from the ashes of this defeat, and we will be offering an amendment next week when the defense appropriations bill comes to the floor of the House to kill it. And let me add one other thing. It's very important. I was glad to hear what Secretary Gates said. We're being told that we can't afford to do health care, that we can't afford to do housing, etc. Well, the military budget is the main reason we can't afford it. If we had not fought that foolish and destructive war in Iraq, we would have the money to pay for the health care. That whole debate wouldn't happen. Going forward, if we don't begin to curtail military spending excesses, then we will be in that bind. If we'd lost this fight, and I give the president a great deal of credit for rallying after we lost the first round, then all bets would have been off, and we would have an ever-increasing military budget, almost literally eating everybody else's lunch.
How is it and why is it that defense spending gets considered in a different way than all other kinds of spending? You've said in the past that people who support the F-22 assume that the defense budget is essentially paid with monopoly money. Why is it that defense spending isn't thought of as something that's finite? It's thought of as something that you can just add to infinitely.
Well, it's partly cultural lag. There was this fear of the Soviet Union, and there was a real military problem. This is a plane, of course, that has never fired a shot in anger, and never will, almost certainly. But military spending, I guess, for conservatives, that's the way to show you're tough and you're patriotic. It's wholly illogical, and I guess I'm not as good at explaining illogic as maybe I should be in my line of work. But as I said, it's partly cultural lag. Well, we got to be strong. And people will say, look, our people are fighting in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We need the F-22. And as you pointed out, it is wholly irrelevant to that. The other thing is that the military contractors have been very clever about putting their people there. And I guess part of it is this. Some liberal Democrats will vote for this. There's a very good union, the Machinists Union, that does a lot of good work, and they are a socially responsible group. And some of their people will be laid off, and that will bother me, and I would be glad to have national policies in place that deal with people who get laid off. So you get the conservatives who are ready to spend on the military unquestioningly, and then you get some liberals who have union ties and don't like to see people thrown out of work for any reason. That's been the coalition. But again, I give the president credit. Frankly, a couple of weeks ago, when the House Armed Services Committee did this, I tried to offer an amendment on the floor, and I couldn't even get the Democratic leadership to allow me to offer the amendment. But we kept up the fight, and that's why I think this is very important. As Gates said, if we can't win this fight, I guess listening to Secretary Gates' channel, Hillel, the great Jewish sage, which is kind of interesting, if not now, when? If we had lost this fight, our ability to begin to curtail the military budget would be over. As of now, if the president follows through on this, let's be very clear, without endangering one iota the security of the United States, we stop spending on Cold War weapons. We don't do any more foolish and destructive wars like Iraq. We could bring down the military budget projections over time. That would pay for health care. We wouldn't be in the bind that we're in trying to figure out how to do both.
Congressman Barney Frank, chair of the House Financial Services Committee. It's a pleasure to have you on the show tonight, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel.